Hello students, this video is being recorded in the summer of 2020, right after the end of the spring semester and in the midst of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Since we do not yet know for sure what format our classes will take in the fall, and since there's some likelihood that at least some of us, both students and faculty, will have to be away from campus for a time should the mitigation plans prove ineffective, or should compliance with or enforcement of public health guidelines prove impossible, I am preparing a video version of each of my lectures for the class to have it ready if and when it is needed. It's also the case that necessary distancing requirements in the classrooms may make it impossible that the entire class can be in the same room at the same time. In that case, those whose turn it is to stay away from campus may find these video lectures a better option than relying on a live classroom feed via Zoom or some other technology. So if you're watching this video, it means that we are, for reasons of public and personal health, still unable to meet together in a traditional face-to-face classroom format. All the same, I'll continue to do my best to teach you what I know with whatever tools I have at my disposal. Enjoy the lecture. So now we'll continue our introduction of some of the basic vocabulary for studying argumentation. And I want to focus today on identifying arguments. That is, when we look at public discourse, whether spoken discourse or written work, how do we know that we're looking at argument? So there are parts of an argument, and we want to be able to identify those parts. And the first thing we need to know is that every argument consists of at least two statements, one of which is a claim and the other of which functions as evidence. So every argument has two statements, at least two statements. One is a claim, and the other statement is evidence or reason or proof in support of the claim. So in order for there to be an argument, you can't just have any two statements, but the two statements, the one serving as the claim, the other serving as evidence, must enable you to make an inference between the two statements. So you have the claim that you're making, the evidence that is offered in support of the claim, and the possibility of there being an inference between those two statements. And I'll explain that a little further as we go on here. So an inference is the mental step that allows us to credit the truth of one statement on the basis of the truth of another statement. In other words, if someone in an argument advances a claim, and that claim, because it's a claim, isn't going to be accepted out of hand, it's not obviously or self-evidently true, then we expect also, once that claim is proposed or advanced, that the person making the claim will offer some reason or proof or evidence in support of the claim. And if that works, that is to say, if we're more likely to accept the claim because we accept or believe the evidence or proof that's offered in support of it, then we can say that we've made an inference. That is, we're more likely to believe the claim because we accept the evidence. And we recognize that the evidence in this case supports the claim. And that mental calculation, that step that we take in our minds that says this evidence is sufficient to support the claim, or because I believe that evidence, or I accept that proof, I'm now more likely to believe the claim, or I believe the claim is more likely or probable than it was before. So the inference is the mental step that allows us to credit the truth of one statement on the basis of the truth of another statement. So the inference then requires us to reason about the connections between the two statements, that is, between the claim and the evidence which supports it. We need to think about what is the claim that's being made and what is the evidence or proof or reason that's offered in support of it. And is that a good reason? That is the proof sufficient? Does the evidence support the claim? And as we're thinking about that, we're making an inference. We're reasoning about the connections between the two statements. So here's an example. Suppose I say, there's likely to be a military draft by the end of the year. And you might say, well, of course, it's possible, but extremely unlikely. I think you're wrong. So here we have a claim. We begin with the claim. The claim is controversial. It's doubted. In fact, maybe you think there's very little chance of it being true. Okay? So by itself, it's insufficient. It can't stand on its own. It requires some additional statement, that is, some evidence or proof or a good reason, in order for us to accept this predictive claim that says there's likely to be a military draft by the end of the year. So what kind of evidence would be sufficient to support a claim like this? Suppose I then say, well, North Korea has just launched a nuclear missile at Alaska. Now you see things have changed. You have an additional statement. North Korea has just launched a nuclear missile at Alaska. And that additional statement has an impact on how likely you are to accept the original statement or the claim. So here's the relationship between evidence and claim. So the second statement about North Korea just launching a missile, that's a factual statement. It could easily be determined to be true or false. You could turn on the news, listen to the radio, watch television, look it up online, see it in a newspaper. You'd be able to determine quickly whether or not that evidence statement is true or false. And once you determined that it was true, that is, once you accepted it as true, you would now be more likely to accept the claim that there's likely to be a military draft by the end of the year. Okay? So once you accept the evidence statement as true, or once I prove it's true to you by showing you the evidence, maybe showing you the front page of a newspaper, right? You'd be more likely to accept my original statement as also being true. But why is that? It's because you would be making an inference. Okay, so the thing that's changed is the evidence has put the original claim in a new light, and you've thought about the relationship of the evidence statement to the original claim. So here's how that works. So you now have evidence that credits the claim, that is, supports it or helps to prove it or makes it more likely or probable, right? And you have more information that you take to be true, the evidence, which enables you to make an inference. So in this case, what would that inference be? Okay, what inference do you make? First of all, you know the fact of the nuclear attack, right? That's the evidence. You've seen that in the newspaper, or you looked it up online, or you heard it on the radio. And you also have the claim that I made about there being a military draft by the end of the year. But in your mind, you're reasoning. You're connecting the two statements that I've given you, right? The fact of the nuclear attack and the claim about the military draft. And in your mind, you're reasoning from your own experience and your own common sense, drawing on what you and many other people understand about how governments and wars and those kinds of things work, not just in this case, but in any case, right? And you reason from experience and common sense by adding in a mental step that says, in effect, in cases of national emergency or military attack, governments are likely to respond by drafting personnel into the military. And that's the inference that enables you to believe the claim on the basis of the evidence. So again, you may know something from history. When during the Civil War there was a draft, during World War I there was a draft, during World War II there was a draft, during the Vietnam War there was a draft. Now you know that the United States has come under attack by an enemy, so you reason, therefore it's likely there may be a draft in this case as well. So you see there's a direct connection between the evidence that's been offered and the claim that's been made, and that connection is what we call the inference. But think about this with a different example, or with a different piece of evidence, and you can see how in some cases the alleged evidence wouldn't allow for an inference. So suppose I said there's likely to be a military draft by the end of the year. I planted Captain Jack pumpkins in my garden. Okay, so I've given you two statements. The first is a claim, and the second is a factual statement, right? But it has no bearing at all on the claim. It cannot function as evidence because it does not connect to any common experience or common sense or American history or anything like that you can draw on to make a connection between one thing and another. There's no inference possible there. So the inference connection or the inference statement is usually implied. That is, it's not usually part of the explicit written or spoken discourse. The inference statement is happening in the minds of the listener or the reader, but it enables the listener or reader to connect the claim that's being made with the evidence that's being offered in support of the claim. So here in summary then are the parts of an argument, and every argument in its most basic form consists of these three parts. There are two statements, an evidence statement and a claim statement, and an inference or a mental step that connects the evidence to the claim. So in our example, we have the evidence of there being a nuclear attack by North Korea on Alaska. We infer that acts of war often prompt institution of a military draft, and therefore we reason to the claim there will be a draft before the end of the year. So we talked about an argument consisting of at least two statements, an evidence statement and a claim statement. But what do we mean by a statement? Okay, one of the statements in an argument is a claim. One of the statements is a reason or evidence in support of the claim. But what is a statement? A statement is a sentence or a part of a sentence that can be true or false. That is, we have to be able to make a judgment about it. Is this true or is this false, right? It may be true or it may be false, or we may not be able to know for certain whether it's true or false. But the key thing is it's a sentence or a part of a sentence that can be true or false. We have to be able to ask, is this true? Okay? That tells us that we have a statement. If we want to think about the difference between a statement and a sentence, we could think of the sentence as the grammatical unit and the statement as the logical unit. Okay? So you can have a sentence, and a sentence can actually contain more than one statement. But the key thing is, for identifying a statement, is that you have to be able to ask, is this true? Because a statement is a sentence or a part of a sentence that can be true or false. And we know that an argument must consist of a minimum of two statements, one of which is a claim and the other of which is evidence in support of the claim. So we talked a little bit about claims already, but think about this. We know that a claim is a statement that is true or false, right? We don't know yet whether it's true or false. In fact, it may be controversial, it may be doubted, and that's why it requires additional evidence. And the evidence statement is usually a statement that we take to be true. It's widely accepted as true. It's easily believed or proven to be true. And that's what enables it to function as evidence, because it doesn't require further proof. It can stand as proof for the claim, but itself doesn't need proof. It's obvious, it's observable, it's factual, it's already widely considered to be true, so it can function as evidence. But in both cases, those are statements, and we can say about them, both the claim and the evidence, is that true? Maybe with the claim, we don't accept it as true yet, but we're more likely to accept it once we understand what the evidence in support of it is. So, some other things about statements. First of all, statements must say something about the real world. So, fictional statements cannot function in arguments because they can't have any evidentiary value. So, a statement must say something about the real world, and a statement that is fictional doesn't have any real world referent. So if I say, for instance, Scarlett O'Hara was from Georgia, we would say that's neither true nor false in relation to the real world. So it can't be an argumentative statement. Scarlett O'Hara was from Georgia can't function as evidence, for instance, because it makes no reference to anything in the real world. Scarlett O'Hara was a fictional character. But if I say, in Margaret Mitchell's novel, Gone with the Wind, the character Scarlett O'Hara was from Georgia, that is a statement because it refers to a book that exists in the real world. Margaret Mitchell was a real person. Gone with the Wind was a book she wrote. The character Scarlett O'Hara was in the book, so that can be a statement, especially if you were arguing, for instance, in a literature class, you might make a statement like this. This could function as evidence. So that's just maybe a subtle distinction, but an important one, that statements that function in arguments must say something about the real world. That is, the true or false claim must make reference to things in the real world. Here's another example. Suppose you're writing a paper for your physics class about the properties of plasma. And in the paper you write, Captain Kirk ordered the engineers to vent plasma from the warp core, thus proving that plasma can exist briefly in an antimatter environment, right? Well, all of that might be true in the universe, the fictional universe of Star Trek, but it would not function as evidence in a real-life physics paper, right? Your physics professor might be entertained by it, but I don't think he would be convinced by it. And that's why we say fictional statements have no evidentiary value, so they cannot function as statements in an argument. Here's another example. Suppose you're writing a paper in your history class, and you write that during President Trump's third term in office, the United States finally annexed Canada. And in a footnote, you cite what you learned from reading a comic book about a time-traveling superhero. So that would be, again, a fictional source. It's an interesting claim. It would be really curious if this was true, right? But it's not true. It can't be true in anything but a fictional context. We know, for instance, presidents can't be elected anymore for third terms. And so it could not function in your real world history paper as an evidence statement in support of a claim. So that's the key distinction. Your statements must say something about the real world. In order to have evidentiary value, they have to be connected to things in the real world. So there are some other sentences that are not statements. So, for instance, if we think of sentences as grammatical units and think of statements as logical units, we can understand that not every sentence is a statement. Some sentences, in other words, cannot be true or false. A question, for instance, is a sentence that is neither true nor false. The answer to the question might be a statement, but the question itself is neither true nor false. So if I ask, "Are you going to the MUB after class?" That's a question. I don't know the answer yet. Maybe that's why I'm asking the question. So the question itself is neither true nor false. You might respond, "Yes, I am going to the MUB after class." So the answer would be a statement. It's either true or false. You either are going to the MUB or you lied to me and you're not going to the MUB, so it would be false. But in either case, we could ask of your answer, is that true or false? But you cannot ask of the question is if it's true or false. So the question itself, though it's a sentence, is not a statement. Some sentences express a wish or a hope, but do not make a truth claim. So, for instance, you might say, "I hope I do well on the calculus quiz." That would be a sentence, but it's not a statement because we can't say that it's true or false. It's certainly true that you have the hope, but do we know you will do well? We can't say it's true or false that you will in fact do well on your calculus quiz. It is expressing a mere hope that you do well. Okay, so neither true nor false, so not a statement. A sentence for sure, but not a statement. Some statements are exclamations. If I yell at you, "Watch out for the rattlesnake," there may or may not be a snake, but in any case, the warning, "watch out," is neither true nor false. It's just important so you don't get bitten by a venomous serpent, right? So we're looking at sentences or parts of sentences that are true or false. And the parts of the sentences that are true or false are statements, and statements function in arguments. Statements which make a statement about a truth claim about something in the real world can function in an argument as a claim or as evidence. So next, let's think about this idea of assertions. And an assertion is simply a statement that is uttered publicly as a truth. So the statement is made, written, or spoken, right? So that others may hear or read it. That's what we mean by uttered publicly. So an assertion is a statement that's uttered publicly as a truth. And when a person makes an assertion, right, we presume that person believes the statement is true. That's one of the common sense presumptions that we have about ordinary human communication and conversation. We don't normally presume people are lying to us. Certainly, sometimes people do lie to us, but our presumption is that they're telling us the truth. So that when a person makes a statement publicly or asserts a statement publicly, we presume that person is making an assertion which they believe to be true. Okay? And we presume the person making the statement wants others to accept the statement as true. So another presumption is when someone speaks to us, makes a statement directed to us, we presume that they think at least that this is worth our knowing, that it is something we would be interested in or want to know, and that the person who's making the assertion wants us to believe it as true as well. It may turn out that what they assert, in fact, is not true. They could be mistaken, right? But The thing is, when a person makes an assertion, that is, when they make a statement publicly, they utter it as a truth claim, we presume that they believe it's true and that they want us to believe it as true as well. So public argument then consists of assertions, people making assertions. Both claims and evidence statements in public argument are assertions. So we go from just the theoretical realm of thinking about argument and its component parts, and we now look at argument as it takes place in public discourse, let's say in the realm of law or politics or social or cultural issues, right? And there, when we begin to look at how argument works, we're looking at not just statements and the relationship of statements, but people making assertions. They're advancing these statements publicly, showing that they believe them and that they want other people to believe them as well. So both claims and evidence statements in public argument are assertions. So just like we talked about in the first lesson, a person who makes an assertion, if it's doubted or if it's controversial, assumes a burden of proof, right? So if I make a claim, if I advance an assertion that would be a claim because it would be controversial, if I make a claim that other people would be likely to doubt or be looking for some evidence in support of, then by making that assertion, I have assumed a burden of proof. I recognize that the statement is controversial. I recognize that my assertion cannot stand on its own. So the expectation is that I will offer additional assertions in support of my claim, all right? So anytime you make an assertion, if it's controversial, you are assuming the obligation or the burden of proof, the obligation to provide additional assertions, that is, to provide evidence or proof in support of your controversial statement. So the person who advances such an assertion commits to defending the statement, giving reasons or evidence for why it is true. Again, go back to the example we used before. If I say there's likely to be a military draft before the end of the year, that would be controversial. You would probably doubt it on its face. You would expect me to support that if you thought I really believed it. You would wonder why I believed it, and the obligation would be on me to provide additional evidence. And I would do that in the form of showing you maybe the headline in the newspaper that said, North Korea launched a nuclear weapon against Alaska. So the person who advances a controversial assertion publicly, that is a public statement making a truth claim, right, also assumes a burden of proof, committing to defend the statement by offering additional reasons or evidence for why it is true. So when we think about assertions as the parts of an argument, that doesn't cover every possible sentence or statement in public discourse. So let's think a little bit more about those other aspects of public discourse. Any speech or writing that contains sequential assertions is discourse. So there's lots of different ways to define what discourse is, but from an argumentative point of view, it's very simple. If you have any writing or speech that contains one assertion after another, we would call that a discourse, right? Now, it may or may not be an argumentative discourse because it may or may not contain claims and evidence and inferences, right? Or invite inferences. But we can talk about discourse when we use the term discourse as referring to just a sequence of assertions, that is, a sequence of publicly made truth claims or statements, right? So a discourse which is not argumentative, that is, a discourse which contains assertions but which does not invite inference making, right? We call such a discourse exposition. So an expositional discourse is non-inferential. That is, it doesn't invite inferences. It's not making assertions, connecting them as evidence and claim, inviting people to reason about them and to see that one is more likely to be accepted or believed because the other is taken to be true. So when it's non-argumentative, right, or non-inferential, we say that that discourse is exposition. Also, any statement in a discourse which is not part of an argument would be exposition. So later on in the semester, we'll be doing some diagramming of arguments. And one of the things you'll need to do there is to think about and identify all of the different parts of the argument and show the structure of the relationship between the assertions, that is, especially the relationship between the evidence and the claims. But there may be parts of the discourse that are not part of the argument in the discourse. And those other parts that are non-argumentative or non-inferential, we would refer to as the exposition. Because, for instance, some statements in a discourse provide context for an argument. They might set the scene in which the argument takes place, or they might give you background information so you'll be able to understand the argument. Some statements are merely descriptive. They don't participate in the argument, but they give us information that's important, okay? And so those parts of the discourse we would refer to as exposition. Now, we've already talked about claims in a number of different ways, but just as a reminder, a claim is a controversial statement that asserts that something is true. We say it's controversial because a claim cannot stand by itself. It's not self-evident, right? A claim cannot stand by itself. A claim requires support. And when someone asserts or advances a claim that is a controversial statement, it is accompanied by a burden of proof. That is, the person making that assertion assumes the obligation to provide additional statements in evidence or proof in support of the original claim. And also, a claim invites reasoning, that is, inference making, on the basis of the evidence that is offered in support of the claim. So if I make a controversial statement, such as there will be a military draft, right? That's not going to be believed just because I said so. You would expect there to be some support. I would assume some burden of proof to provide that evidence. And when I provide the evidence, I would be inviting you to do some reasoning about it. That is, to make an inference on the basis of the evidence that is offered in support of the claim. Evidence, on the other hand, is asserted in support of a claim. So evidence is a statement made publicly, right, that is used to support a claim statement. Evidence consists of statements known or believed to be true by the audience to whom the statement is directed. So this is a kind of rhetorical idea here where we're thinking about the relationship of the statement to the audience who is asked to accept it, right? So if I assert an evidence statement, I'm doing so because at least I believe members of the audience will accept that statement to be true, and so it can function as evidence in support of the controversial statement I made, which would be the claim. Evidence can consist of a variety of different kinds of statements, right? So they could be observable facts or conditions. That is, they would be empirical evidence. They would be available to our senses in some way to check or prove to be true. So even if let's say you were living in Alaska and you looked up one day and you saw the bright flash in the sky, and that was the explosion of the nuclear weapon, right? That would be observable fact or condition, at least for the people in Alaska, that they had been attacked by a nuclear weapon, right? But then we also have opinion as to fact, that is reliable testimony. For those in the rest of the country who maybe didn't see the nuclear bomb go off in Alaska, we would be listening on the radio to a report, or would be reading it in a newspaper. It would be secondhand, but it would be opinion as to fact. That is to say, it would be testimony about the fact. And insofar as we found the source of that testimony to be credible, that is, our experience tells us to trust this news source or to believe that newspaper, right? Then we would take that as evidence, because as members of the audience, we would know or believe to be true the statement that was made about the nuclear attack on Alaska. But evidence can also be widely held beliefs, values, and public knowledge, right? So sometimes we don't need proof in an empirical sense. Sometimes we know things to be true because of our experience, or because of what everybody believes, or how we usually do things, or our widely held and shared values, and we draw on that as well. And insofar as everybody or most people usually believe a certain thing, that can function as evidence too in a public argument. And then also finally, when we think about how argument works, if somebody advances a claim and it is controversial, but then provides evidence to support the claim, and now the claim is more probable or more likely and more widely believed, right? That previous controversial statement or the previous claim, now proven, can become evidence for a subsequent claim, okay? So once a claim has been established as true, it's no longer doubted or controversial, and because it's no longer doubted or controversial, or in other words, because it's now more widely believed, it can function as evidence for the next claim. And in that way, we could build on a chain of inferences to support an ultimate claim to which our whole argument might be leading. Okay? So 4 types of evidence then, and we'll talk a little bit more about evidence in the next lesson. But observable facts or conditions, opinion as to fact, widely held beliefs, values, and public knowledge, or previously established claims. Okay? Those are the types of evidence. So then, altogether, what do we think of as argumentation? Right? Argumentation is the process of publicly advancing claims and evidence. And argumentation could also be the verbal, that is, discursive record of reasoning. Because if you looked at, for instance, the transcript of a debate, you would see the verbal record of the reasoning of the participants in the debate, the different ways in which they advanced their claims and their evidence and invited the inference of the audience. Right? Reasoning is the mental process of inference making, which is central to the whole process of argumentation. So when you are inviting an audience to engage in reasoning, that is, in inference making, you are also engaged in argumentation. Reasoning is also the process of giving reasons, that is, providing evidence in support of a claim about which others may reason or make inferences. So when we're using these terms, argumentation and reasoning, we're using those terms in a specific way. They're meant to refer to specific mental and discursive processes, right?